Hello viewers. Today we will be discussing the topic Global Political Economy in the Cold War Era. In this module we will be discussing the interaction between political and economic forces that were impacted during the Cold War era. Now, global political economy is a subdiscipline of the field of international relations that deals with interactions between political and economic forces. While at the center of this study is the concept of human welfare and state perspective, we also find certain other dimensions coming within this era of study. One such important area of study is the impact of global economic forces on state actors, as well as the interactions between state, corporate interests, as well as the international organizations. Naturally, these changes in the world have led to a rethinking of the way we understand individuals, states, and economic actors in the international arena. Global political economy initially centered on studies of security issues. However, with the rise of the Cold War rivalry, what we find that economic security role of states as international actors have led to a redesigning of the scope of global political economy. Today, global political economy encompasses studies on states and economic actors, role of multinational corporate interest, rise of international economic organizations, as well as the role of non-state actors also in the global process. International political economy grew in importance as a result of various dramatic international economic events, such as the collapse of the Bretton Woods International Monetary System in 1971 and the oil crisis in 1973-74. Now, the Cold War era led to the division of the world into three groups. The first world comprised of US and its allies, the West European countries, along with Canada, Australia, New Zealand. The second world comprised of the communist countries of Eastern Europe and Soviet Union. The third world comprised of the developing and the underdeveloped countries which were gradually coming out of the colonization process. Some countries such as China fell into both the second world and the third world. Now, each of these worlds exhibited different political and economic dimensions which contributed to the growing influence of the global political economy. Let us first start with the first world, wherein we will try to see how the US Western political economy contributed to the global influence on political economy. In fact, to understand global political economy, we have to focus on three main dimensions: the US-led Western political economy, the Soviet Union-led communist political economy, and the southern political economy comprising of countries of Asia and the developing world. Let us start off our discussion with the US-led political economy. Now, following the Second World War, US and its allies created a new international system to provide security and economic growth to its allies and partners and members of the Western Alliance of capitalist countries. Now, US and its allies drew their lessons from the 1930s and the 1940s economic collapse, and US provided a security umbrella to its allies, and the new international institutions were created to foster democracy, economic growth, and security. The US used its unparalleled economic and military dominance to construct a set of institutions to manage the entire world economy. The International Trade and Payments Order, constructed as the Second World War drew to a close, was in theory a negotiated order with the principal participants, the US and UK. However, in reality, the order was largely shaped by US power and it reflected US interests. Therefore, Western political economy basically reflected the ideas and interests of the US political dominance on the new world order. Unlike economic nationalism of the 1930s, the US-led political economy rejected bilateralism and brought about multilateralism and regionalism in global political economy. The US-led new political order was characterized by legalism, liberalism, and multilateralism. While liberalism was the core idea of the laissez-faire system, but the New World Order did not follow the conventional laissez-faire system of free market. However, in the wake of political mobilization, different working class movement, what happened was laissez-faire system, liberal ideas were entwined with individual welfare, and states were under an obligation to pursue welfare-related provisions and policies. What we find is that apart from liberalism, multilateralism became the core order of the New World System introduced by the US Western political system. The multilateralism rested on domestic political economies that were interventionist. There was no automatic adjustment as in the gold standard, nor was free trade unrestricted. The goal was to create an economic system that had liberal attributes, but that did not undermine domestic stability of the countries in any way. Ruggie termed this order based on Keynesian principles as one of embedded liberalism. Now let us try to understand what is embedded liberalism. Embedded liberalism was committed to a liberal international economy, but the liberalism was tempered by domestic state intervention to support social purposes such as full employment. Western states participated in a number of economic institutions designed to free economic exchange. 3 international organizations were created to oversee the liberal international economic order. While ostensibly committed to universal membership, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the GATT restricted membership to countries committed to follow free market principles in their domestic economic management. The IMF and the World Bank were designed in 1944 to provide for a stable monetary system and fund post-war reconstruction of economies. Additional funding to aid reconstruction was provided by the US in the form of the very popular Marshall Plan. The attempt to create an international trade organization failed, but then GATT was created, which served as a framework for liberalizing trade in the world. These 3 institutions were created, that is the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and GATT, to overcome the persistent economic problems that had arisen in the 1930s and 1940s. An important development in the post-war global political economy has been the creation of regional economic institutions, which played a very, very important role in this entire global economic order. The most important of these economic organizations and institutions matured in Western Europe. Sheltering behind the security umbrella of US and North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that is NATO, European states created the European Economic Community or the Common Market through the Treaty of Rome in 1957 to bring about greater economic integration. This was continued through a greater process of integration through the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community, followed by the transition of the European Economic Community into the European Union, which brought about greater European integration by bringing together political and economic interests under one transnational organization. Now, the unprecedented levels of economic cooperation leading to monetary union have not translated into effective harmonization of foreign and economic interests, not to forget the security policies. However, the European Union states collectively have emerged as rivals to US dominance in a number of issue areas. Sheltered by the nuclear umbrella and supported by sympathetic economic institutions, the US, Western Europe, Japan, and other allies followed policies of economic growth in the post-war era. Global policy redistributed income, supported industry, and maintained full employment. Most of the states followed these policies of welfare in their respective domestic policies. The provision of credit and a series of technical innovations facilitated a golden era of economic growth in Western states from the 1950s to somewhat early 1970s. This system had come under immediate strain as the US spending on the Vietnam War and the rising oil prices caused inflation and recession. Now, 1970s heralded a new era in US dominance. The northern states increasingly moved from providing welfare to preparing their citizens to face global economic competition. The US and the UK pushed for reforms in the area of trade, finance, monetary gains, which was designed to give greater play to the market forces and reduce the ability of the state to intervene in economic affairs. These reforms undermined the principles of embedded liberalism, pushing the economy towards a neoliberal direction. These neoliberal ideas were captured well by the very famous Washington Consensus. This consensus in liberal economic policy was applied domestically and also exported to developing countries through international organizations and transnational policy networks. Let us now try to understand what is this Washington Consensus, how did it evolve? The term Washington Consensus was coined in 1989 by the very famous economist John Williamson. It is a list of 10 policy prescriptions for improving economic performances in Latin American countries. Now, the first principle of the Washington Consensus was to reduce national budget deficits. Now, it was found out that large domestic deficits had contributed to high and varied rates of inflation in Latin America during the 1980s. Policymakers prescribed fiscal discipline by raising tax revenues or cutting domestic spending to ensure and reduce the need for government borrowing and therefore leading to greater economic stability. The second principle of the Washington Consensus was redirect spending from politically popular areas towards neglected fields with high economic returns. This entails that some components of public spending, for example, subsidies to state-owned firms or for food or fuel consumption, would lead to economic distortions and favored rich urban populations as opposed to the rural poor. Therefore, the need was to reduce subsidies of politically connected economic sectors, which can inflict cost on some, but free up spending to support basic social services such as education, employment, infrastructure, etc. The third principle of the Washington Consensus was to reform the entire tax system. Reform should broaden the tax base and remove exemptions that exclude some politically connected taxpayers and organizations from paying taxes. The fourth principle entailed liberalization of the finance sector with the goal of market-determined interest rates. Government controls on interest rates tend to punish savers and discourage investment, we all know that, while stifling financial development. Rationing credit trends to breed corruption and favor political insiders. Therefore, what was promoted was market-determined interest rates should promote savings and ensure that banks or various financial institutions and not government politicians determine allocation of credit. Fifthly, it provided for the adoption of a competitive single exchange rate system. This implied that the strategy was to move away from overvalued exchange rates that discourage exports and lead to foreign exchange rationing, a competitive market-driven exchange rate which can promote export-led economic growth and therefore in the long run reduce the balance of payment problems. The sixth principle of the Washington Consensus focused on reduction of trade restrictions. It was believed that trade restrictions that promote special interests should be reduced in general. Tariffs are preferable to quotas and other arbitrary trade restrictions that strangle trade. The seventh principle of the Washington Consensus focused on abolition of barriers to foreign direct investment of FDI. Banning or restricting inward foreign investment gives domestic firms a monopoly and reduces competition. Foreign investment allows a country to gain capital, create jobs, create better infrastructure, build skills, while exposing domestic firms to greater competition. This was the need of the day. Eighth principle of the Washington Consensus focused on privatization of state-owned enterprises. It was believed that state-owned enterprises were increasingly inefficient, surviving only with the help of government subsidies that widen countries' fiscal deficits. Privatization may cause some unemployment in the short run, but is more likely to raise the efficiency of productivity of these small scale and large scale sectors, and in the long run increase national productivity as well as growth. Ninth principle focused on abolition of policies that restrict competition. Removing regulations and obstacles that prevent new firms from entering the marketplace can instigate and instill competition, efficiency as well as economic growth. Finally, it focused on providing secure and affordable property rights. A legal system that grants and upholds property rights, including the rights of people working in the informal job sector, not officially reported and holding land without official documentation, incentivize investment and individual liberty. Private assets enable owners to access credit, expanding the economy and the government tax base. It was believed that this Washington Consensus would engage economies and states to bring about greater development and growth. So far, we have studied the US-led Western political economy. Let us now come to the second part of our discussion, that is the communist-led global political economy. While the US-led capitalist economic system focused on individuals and corporate interests, the communist-led political economy believed in state control and collectivization of industries and agriculture. In contrast to the Western system, where individuals and corporations owned property and the allocation of resources were largely determined by the supply and demand of the market, the communist system completely eliminated private property and allocated resources through the central planning machinery. The communist system, we all know, began in Russia after the 1917 revolution. With Russia's defeat of the Nazis in Eastern and Central Europe, the Soviet form of communism extended to countries such as Ukraine, Poland, Romania, and East Germany. Social revolutions led by communist parties in cooperation with the peasant movements brought central planning to countries as diverse as China, Cuba, Vietnam, North Korea, Ethiopia, and Angola. Communist states, we know, were authoritarian one-party states where other forms of political expression were suppressed by the respective communist parties. Communist states achieved a large number of notable successes, but these were often accompanied by horrendous human cost and eventual failure. Following the Russian Revolution, the Soviet Union was able to industrialize its primary rural economy. By the mid-1960s, the technology of Soviet Union had advanced to such a level that it posed a severe military threat to Western Europe, and it was engaged in a space race with the US. The Soviet Union also made considerable progress in women's equality, liberty, and healthcare of its population. This was a commendable trait on the part of the communist political economy. However, we need to understand that collectivization of agriculture in the Soviet Union was accomplished through a combination of force and starvation at the cost of millions of lives. In economic terms, Though Soviet Union enjoyed some degree of economic growth, but it fell short in creating growth in several other areas. It was able to show progress in the areas of the economy that required people or resources in the production process, but less successful in areas that required technology and innovation. While the Soviet Union was able to produce heavy industry and basic goods, it was unable to develop consumer goods in competition with the Western allies. Unable to produce consumer goods desired by many of its population and increasingly falling behind in the arms race with Western states, the Soviet growth model had reached its limits by the early 1980s. The 1990s saw Eastern European states, Russia and the former republics of the Soviet Union struggle to establish functioning capitalist economies and liberal democratic states with varying degree of success. The Chinese communist model enjoyed less success than its Russian counterpart. A series of failed 5-year plans and the Cultural Revolution turned many of its own citizens, leading to industrial stagnation and agricultural shortfalls. In China, by 1979, the Chinese leadership had concluded that economic development would require a gradual opening up to the Western economies. Special economic zones were created to attract investment from Western states to China. Over the next 35 years, China transformed many areas of its economy into capitalist forms with large inflows of Western investment and the introduction of private property system. Unlike Soviet Union, China did not adopt political liberalization and continued an authoritarian form of state control, strict censorship, one-party state system, and minimum place for political dissent. By the early 1990s, two of these communist states, Russia and China, abandoned almost all tenets of communism. Russia evoked a fully capitalist state model fueled by wealth and natural resources with the institutionalized form of democracy. Its transition to capitalism was marred by the rise of wealthy oligarchs who stripped the assets of the former state and ensured that rule of law was firmly established. What happened in China? In China, tremendous wealth was generated in some areas of the country, lifting millions of the population out of poverty and bringing about tremendous economic growth. However, we need to understand at the same time the challenges of social stability at a time of rapid economic transformation under an authoritarian state system was highly intense. Let us come to the third part of the discussion, what was happening in the developing countries, which we call the southern political economy. As the Soviet Union and US struggled for advantage in the Cold War, another historic process was taking place, and that was the decolonization process in Asia, Africa and Latin American countries. Some states have experienced success in their attempts to develop their economies in the post-1945 period. Japan, one of these foremost states, were able to rebuild its economy after US occupation, while the four Asian tigers, they are South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong and Singapore, achieved incredible progress in terms of growth rate, education levels and infrastructural development. The rise of these new centers of economic power in Asia and the oil-producing states in the 1970s was so dramatic that some analysts in the US feared that American domination or hegemony was on the decline. Coming to Asian political economy, some Asian leaders began to believe that a developed political economy superior to the US could be possible and with a better set of Asian values and developmental processes. In contrast to some Asian success stories, many of the world's populous countries such as China, India, Brazil, Indonesia and most of South Africa suffered a series of setbacks in their pursuit of developmental agenda. In some areas such as China, until the reform process embarked during the 1970s, disastrous central planning destroyed agriculture as well as industrial productivity. In some of the sub-Saharan African countries, we find that they were trapped into producing products that declined in value over time, for example, coffee, tin, etc., Insecurity within and between these sub-Saharan African states led to resources being diverted to fighting other states and internal guerrilla movements. In many instances, the debt crisis of the 1980s halted development projects in these developing countries. But we need to understand that despite these setbacks, sub-Saharan African countries and the Asian countries emerged as thriving political economies in the 21st century. What can be deduced from the discussion that we just had about the global political economy in the Cold War period? Number one, economies played a very important role both for the First World, Second World and the Third World. Secondly, on the Soviet side, dominance meant constructing an economic bloc of centrally planned economies that were designed to resist the seduction of the Marshall Plan and the re-emerging of West European capitalism. On the US side, we find that leadership meant helping to modernize the Western European countries and its allies' economies, as well as integrate political, economic and security considerations over the overarching framework of political economy. Thus, the Cold War not only had far-reaching political and security implications, but it also had far-reaching and impactful impact on the global political economy. Thank you.